Have you ever been on a long journey? Have you ever been on a long journey? You know, if you think about it, going on a long journey takes a certain amount of preparation. You have a particular destination in mind that you want to reach. Yet you also have to make peace with the fact that in order to get there, it's going to take a certain amount of endurance. You know, I used to think I knew what a long car journey was until I went to America. You know, in the UK, when you say you're just going down the road, it might mean a 10 to 15-minute journey. But in America, just down the road could mean 1 to 2 hours. But when we were children, we used to go to the US regularly to visit family. And one year we drove, I believe, from Alabama to Miami, some 10 and a half hours. My 2 cousins were with us in the car. They were younger, and you know how it is when you have younger ones traveling with you on a long journey. You have to bring along various pieces of entertainment, coloring books and handheld devices with games on them and candy. But you see, the thing is with a long journey is that inevitably there comes a point where the coloring books have been colored in. The batteries on the handheld devices start to run low and flash red. And the candy is spent. And I remember as we traveled in the car, there came a moment when all of a sudden the scratching in the coloring book had stopped. The noises from the Game Boy ceased. And then with rice cakes in hand, the inevitable question came from my cousins, do you know what that is? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? And as I read Amos chapter 8, verses 4 to 6, I was struck by the impression that for some in Amos's time, the Sabbath was a little bit like going on a long journey. Their experience of the Sabbath was something a bit like a necessary evil, something that they had to endure, something that they had to make peace with in order to arrive at their desired destination. When will the new moon be over that we may sell grain? And the Sabbath be ended that we may market wheat? One of the interesting things about the book of Amos is that here we find a prophet called to preach in a context of wealth and privilege. You see, the people of Israel at this time were living at a time of prosperity. And they lived in a cultural context where wealth was equated with God's favor. And so by all accounts, the people appeared to be experiencing an outpouring of God's blessing. However, much like today, the blessings that were experienced by a select few. It was a time where the middle classes were squeezed almost to the point of non-existence. And Israel had in fact become a society of extremes. The rich were very rich and the poor were very poor. And like many people, like many millennials today, Amos the prophet found it necessary to supplement his income. And he in fact worked 2 jobs. One was a shepherd, and the other was that of a farmer of sycamore figs. Amos 7 verse 14, he says, I was neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet, but I was a shepherd, and I also took care of sycamore fig trees. Maybe you could even say that in addition to his main job, Amos also did a freelance on the side. But the bottom line is that along with this wealth and success that Israel experienced, gradually they became a society that was permeated by the pursuit of money. And as they became more and more materialistic, they engaged in the exploitation of others. You heard the text. Skimping the measure, boosting the price and cheating with dishonest scales, buying the poor and needy for a pair of sandals, selling the sweepings of the wheat. When I read this part, I thought, what might that look a little bit like today? And I wonder, how many of us in here have recently bought a packet of crisps? A few of us, yeah. Have you noticed that when you buy a packet of crisps, they have so much promise that the bag is full and it almost swells? Have you noticed? And then as soon as you open it, you dip your hand in and there's what? 5 or 6 crisps? But the same weight. It's interesting. Boosting the price and cheating with dishonest scales. Those of us who are meat eaters might be able to relate with the fact that sometimes when you purchase particular items, you then put it into the oven and discover that most of it was water. It's a way of getting more income out of the same item, right? Or maybe some of us frequent McDonald's. And you buy your veggie burger and lift the lid up. And notice that whereas before you used to get a whole square of cheese, now it's cut in 2. But yet you pay the same price for the burger. You see, these are symptoms of a society driven by profit. And you see, the dynamic that we see in the text is a dynamic wherein during the week from Sunday to Friday, the people would make money by dishonest means, and the Sabbath simply became a day when they paused their dishonest practices and worshipped God, and then went back to their illicit practices as soon as the sun went down. Stated differently, there was a mindset that said it's okay to exploit, it's okay to be dishonest so long as it's not on the Sabbath. During the week, they lived in a way that actually reflected very little of the God they claimed to worship. And Sabbath became something akin to a miraculous transformation that would take place for 24 hours. They became saints. But you see, within this context, the prophet Amos speaks to the very heart of the situation. You see, as much as the people behaved differently on the Sabbath, Amos's message was one that recognized that their hearts remained unchanged. For as much as they participated in the Sabbath, they couldn't wait for it to be over so that they could go back to making money and doing what they really loved. Rather than viewing the Sabbath as something that enhanced their lives, it seems that for some, the Sabbath actually got in the way. Because it equated to a period of time in which they were not able to make more profit. You see, the complaint in Amos is twofold. One, when will the new moon be over that we may sell grain? Two, and the Sabbath be ended that we may market wheat. You see, what's interesting is that the new moon was essentially a monthly day of rest. And so in addition to the Sabbath, the weekly day of rest, every month on the new moon, there was another festival. And in effect, it was as if God was saying, do you know what? In addition to your Sabbath, you're going to get another 12 days holiday in the year. In the words of the medical doctor and professor of theology, Sigve Tonstad, the rest brought about by the New Moon Festival, along with the principles of rest and relief, such as the year of Jubilee, where every 50 years debts were forgiven and land restored to its original owners, who may have sold it due to hard times. These things formed outposts of the Sabbath itself. You see, the Sabbath is more than just one day in the week. Its principles can be found much more broadly. And so the interesting thing is that when we start to think about what does this mean? What are the implications? What does this tell us about God and his intentions behind the Sabbath? Imagine the type of society in which Amos lived, a society permeated by materialism, a society permeated by the bottom line. The kind of society where, although a company might make a profit in year one, if the profit in year two is not greater than year one, it's still considered to be a bad year. A society where in order to make money, the workers have to be squeezed, and we find the introduction of unfavorable work practices, cuts in pensions and increases in VAT. Into that context, God brings the seventh day. No matter what you're doing, one day a week, you rest. Into that context, God brings the New Moon Festival. In addition to your one day of rest, you're going to have one day holiday each month. Into a context where people are burdened by debt, where some people have to sell their homes and their land in order to try and make ends meet. God introduced the year of Jubilee, where debts are forgiven and properties restored to its original owner. You see, the Sabbath is about more than just a day of rest. The Sabbath has deep-rooted connections with economic and social justice. And so, in a society permeated by materialist thinking, where profits are gained by exploiting others, the Sabbath, in a real and tangible way, came to become something of a safeguard for the little man. It protected the vulnerable from the excesses of greed, and it reminded the wealthy of the dangers of self-reliance, and it reminded everybody that there was a God who watched over and cared for each and every one. Stated differently, through the Sabbath, God recognizes and honors the work that you do with your hands. In fact, one scholar goes as far as stating that the capacity to work ought to be regarded as sacred. He says, a man's most sacred property is his labor, because it is the possession of those who have nothing else. Think about it this way. For most people, even if they have no money in their bank account, they possess the ability, the potential to work and earn and provide for their families, as well as providing for others. So think about it this way. Through the Sabbath, God is actually seeking to preserve us. He's seeking to protect our capacity to provide for ourselves. He's seeking to protect our capacity to provide for our families. He's seeking to protect our capacity to provide for others. You see, God recognizes how hard you work during the week. He sees the hours that you put in. Some of us working jobs that we really would rather not have. But we do it, and we do it to the best of our ability because we recognize that we need to do it in order to survive and to provide for our families. God sees that and God honors it. And so God seeks to preserve your capacity to work by saying, do you know what? No one can work 24/7, 365 days in the year. In fact, if you did or if you do, potentially you are harming your capacity to provide for yourself, family, and others. And so through the Sabbath, God seeks to protect us. And so when you think about all that the Sabbath is, its deep-rooted connections with social and economic justice, it seems quite remarkable that the people of Israel couldn't wait for it to end. But what's more remarkable is the reason why they couldn't wait for it to end. They couldn't wait for it to end so that they could go back to skimping the measure, boosting the price, cheating with dishonest scales, buying the poor with silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, selling the sweepings of the wheat. You see, it almost doesn't make sense. Because you see, if the Sabbath has deep-rooted connections with social and economic justice, how can those who are participating in the Sabbath on a weekly basis be okay with practicing exploitation outside of the seventh day? You see, it appears to be the case that in the time of Amos, as much as the people participated in the Sabbath, their implementation of its principles did not extend beyond the seventh day. I'll say that again. It seems as though as much as they participated in the Sabbath, their implementation of its principles did not extend beyond the seventh day. How can you love people on Sabbath and exploit them on Sunday? How can you feed the hungry on Saturday and walk past the homeless on Monday? You see, essentially the message of Amos is this: for you to be a true Sabbath keeper, the principles guiding the Sabbath ought to be present in your life every day of the week. We can't be one person on Sabbath and a totally different person from Sunday to Friday. And the fact that the people of Israel couldn't wait for the Sabbath to end so that they could go back to the exploitative practices suggests that perhaps they didn't truly understand what the Sabbath was about. They engaged with it. They followed its rules and regulations. They did what was laid out by their spiritual leaders, but its deeper principles and purposes didn't permeate their lives. Certainly, it seemed as though the Sabbath was a little bit like a long journey. Something, or rather a period of time that you had to pass through before you could get back to doing what you really want to do. Making money. Driving up profits. Let's reflect together a little. The Sabbath begins on Friday sunset. It ends Saturday sunset. A period of, say, 24 hours, give or take a little. How do you personally relate to that period of time? Let's just take a minute and be honest with ourselves. How do we personally relate to that period of time? Does it ever feel like a long journey? Does it ever feel like a period of time that we have to endure in order to get to where we want to be? Do we ever find ourselves in situations like that of ancient Israel, where at times it appears as though the Sabbath is getting in the way of financial goals, personal goals, dreams of success? Do we ever find that after a couple of hours into the Sabbath, we, like children on a long journey, find ourselves asking the question, are we there yet? You see, today God has created a space for us to reflect on why we do what it is that we do. You see, yes, it's true. When it comes to the Sabbath, yes, there's the aspect in which God says, remember the Sabbath day. But I want to suggest to you that there is so much more. Laura Hartman puts it this way. She says, observing the Sabbath both inculcates and expresses values that serve to vaccinate Christians against market idolatry and consumerism. The lessons learned sustain those values throughout the rest of the week. She suggests, stated differently, that the Sabbath is almost a way of vaccinating us against the inevitable pressures of living in a materialistic society. But not only that, the lessons that we learn through the seventh day also sustain those values throughout the rest of the week. You see, the principles embedded in the seventh day ought to continue with us throughout the rest of our life. And I would suggest to you that perhaps the Sabbath should not be seen as a journey, a period of time that we pass through in order to get to where we want to be. Perhaps the Sabbath ought actually to be seen as a destination, a place that we look to arrive at, having passed through the other 6 days of the week. A place of peace, a time where we refocus and remember what's important, a time where we look after others, we seek to meet their needs, a time where we hit the reset button and find ourselves refreshed in God's presence and in the presence of the community of believers. And when we look at the Sabbath that way, surely that's a destination that we all seek. Having worked hard through the rest of the week, God has set up a time in which we can lay those aside and rest. After all, was it not Jesus who said in Mark 2:27, "The Sabbath is made for man, and not man for the Sabbath"? This is another look at the Sabbath. A challenge to take the principles that we find on the seventh day and implement them in the other 6. You see, as we look at the Sabbath, and as we look at its broader implications, its connotations of social and economic justice, and as we consider its implications, we come to realize that it truly has the ability to radically change our approach and our perspective on life. If the Sabbath is about preserving individuals in part from economic exploitation, that may have implications for the products that we buy in the supermarket. That may have implications for how we decide to treat and relate to others who we manage in our offices and in our workplaces. And so, friends, I encourage you, I encourage us to take another look at the Sabbath, to take its principles and implement them in the other 6 days of the week and in the rest of our lives. Amen.